Everybody, welcome to the Warnell Seminar. I love the Warnell Seminar. It's a great chance to see everybody that's working in different areas, get it all together in one room to kind of see some cutting edge research each week. If you're in the seminar class, please make sure you sign that you were here for attendance. Also, remember you had a post on 3 out of the 8 or so seminars that we have. And I'm going to introduce Dr. James Martin. He's going to take over here and introduce our speaker. Thank you, James.
All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dwayne Elmore. I'm going to cheat a little bit, look at my computer to remember some things along the way, but Dwayne joins us today. He came up this morning from Tall Timbers Research Station, where he is the director of Gamebird Research. He's been there since 2023, so I guess almost the fall will be 2 years. Is that right? Before that, he was at Oklahoma State for, I believe, 17 years. Man, I'm doing good so far. And there he was an extension specialist, but also part of his Dow program for Gamebird Research, where he worked on bobwhites, scale quail, turkeys, lesser and greater prairie chickens. And so almost any Galliform you would find in that part of the world. Before that, he was at Utah State, where he got his PhD, working on sage grouse and prairie dogs and things like that. And before that, he was at Mississippi State, where he did a mourning dove project. Before that, he was at the University of Tennessee, Martin. He was smart enough not to go to Knoxville for obvious reasons. And that's where he's originally from, the University of Tennessee. He married a Georgia girl, though. Like myself, probably the best decision he ever made. And her family's been in Georgia, I believe, 5 generations. Is that right? And y'all own land in Braintree area?
That's there, near Dothan.
Dothan, okay. So not far from the Alabama line. So that's kind of the rundown of his past, and I'll just add my own flavor to it. He has one major fatal flaw, and that is he has German short-haired pointers. His hunting dog. Everybody knows me that I'm a setter guy, and I always like to pick on Dwayne about his short hair. And he even's got this short hair sticker on the slide. Put there just for me, I guarantee you. But I've known Dwayne for quite a few years now, and since he moved to Tall Timbers, got to know him even more. In addition to being a great scientist, he's a good dude too, which really matters in this profession. Spends a lot of time with his employees, mentoring them, and very solid guy all around. He spent time with us today at lunch talking to graduate students and staff and what have you. So he's the kind of guy that after the seminar, if you don't get to talk to him and 6 months down the road, if you have a question and you need some advice from somebody that's been in this profession a long time, he's the guy you can send an email to or call, and he'll lend you the ear. So I really value that about Dwayne. So I can't say any more good about him today. I'll take up too much more time, and I don't want to take time away from the seminar, but he's going to talk to us today about thermal ecology of Galliformes, which obviously is a subject near and dear to my heart. So Dwayne, please come up, sir.
Well, thank y'all for being here. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? In the back? Is that good enough? Okay.
Yeah.
If anybody has trouble, just please interrupt me. I want to make sure that you can hear me in the back. Thank you for the introduction, James. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to talk to you. Well, first of all, when I was asked to come speak, I didn't have a topic given. It was like, cover whatever you want. That's a dangerous thing for a former extension person to be given that kind of latitude. But, I thought, well, there's going to be a variety of folks with different backgrounds in the audience. So a lot of my research has been on quail, grouse, turkey, but just thinking about something that might be broadly applicable to anybody, whether you're forestry, fishery, or a wildlife biologist, that you might see some application to. So for the past decade or so, I've worked on this issue of thermal ecology, particularly how it pertains to space use, habitat selection for ground nesting birds. So what I'm going to do today is kind of highlight some of the points from some of these projects. I've had probably 7 or 8 graduate students during that time that have worked on some aspect of this. A lot of them are referenced citations throughout. And then I've had the pleasure of working with some really great colleagues at Utah State, Oregon State, North Dakota State, and Texas A&M, Kingsville, other places that have kind of also done similar work over the years. So I'm going to kind of highlight some of that. But what I want to say out of the gate is this is really novel ground. Like, there's not a lot published on this subject for most species. If you get in the fish world and some of the herpetofauna, it's pretty well established how important temperature is for lots of different physiologic processes and habitat selection and survival. In the bird world, especially ground nesting bird world, there's not much. And when I first started doing this, there was almost nothing, which was both kind of liberating, but also a little scary. Everything we did seemed novel and publishable, but it was also like you have to kind of build foundational knowledge. Like there wasn't a lot to build off of. One of the few papers that I felt like was really helpful in designing projects was this one at the top, Guthrie et al., which was a wildlife monograph. Monograph, by its name, tells you there's a lot in there. That's a meaty paper. I mean, it's 36 pages of information from one study, but it's even meatier than the number of pages would tell you. You could generate many dozens of workable, testable hypotheses from this one. And this, if you want kind of some background information, this would be a good paper to read. Fred hired me at Oklahoma State. He was an important mentor early in my career. Brilliant guy. Can be very gruff, but brilliant guy. And this is a really good paper, in my opinion. It should be cited more. But the first published paper that I had on the subject was Hovick et al. 2014. It was on greater prairie chickens. And I have to give a little disclaimer that it's really my graduate student, Tori Hovick, who's now faculty at North Dakota, that got me into this arena. I was already fascinated by this subject, particularly how little we knew about it. I mean, we're talking this quail in this case. Bobwhite's one of the most studied birds in the world. By my count, it's probably the second most published bird in North America, and probably only behind mallard. But yet there'd been really nothing talking about how temperature might affect it. Superficial things like, well, it was a bad weather year, so production was down. But actually empirically trying to quantify that and understand the mechanisms, very little done. Fred was kind of a groundbreaker there, but I still was a late adopter because Tori was the one that convinced me that we should look at this on his nesting study of greater prairie chickens. And I have to admit, I tried to talk him out of it. I said, no, let's do something easier. I don't think that's going to be publishable. There's probably nothing there. And he was right and I was wrong. Turned out in that study that temperature was the biggest predictor of nest success for greater prairie chickens in that 3-year study. And that was an epiphany for me. I was like, okay, I don't think I really know what habitat even means. I need to back up and probably take a broader look about what drives habitat selection. This Journal of Thermal Biology is another place that y'all might want to take a look in if you want to look at some of the literature on this subject. And it's broad. That's a global journal. There's papers from all kinds of taxa from all over the world, certainly not just birds. So, background. The take-home point that I hope you get from this is not that temperature is like the most important thing in animal habitat selection or survival. It's not, but it's an important thing. And so just try to broaden your perspective about what habitat might mean. And when I'm talking about habitat, I mean, I'm not talking about a plant community. I'm not talking about vegetation type. I'm talking about the food, water, cover, space, all the requirements that a species or organism needs to survive. And particularly when you think about it from a cover standpoint, that's what temperature, it's really driving cover selection and where animals might spend time under certain environmental stressful periods. So this is a schematic example of how that might fit. When you've got these thermal filters that things are having to move through that ultimately relate to the environment that's available for an animal, an organism, or a species. And you can think about this as a thermal niche or a thermal envelope. The space, time and space, really, that an organism can exist in. More on that later when we think about climate, where climate might be going. But you can immediately populate a list of a lot of things that temperature might affect. Where an animal chooses to be at certain times, periods of the year, certain times of the day, how it might move across the landscape or not move, the resources that are available. Because if you're constrained by environmental stressors, there might be resources that are there but are functionally out of your reach. That's an important consideration. And then vital rates, nest initiation. We saw this a lot in Oklahoma when I was working there, that if you had 3 or 4 days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, nest initiations of bobwhite ceased. It was so predictable. It was, I mean, you could see it coming on the long range forecast, like, oh, well, we won't pick up any new nest here in a couple of weeks, because I see on the weather forecast, it's going to be 103, 105, 107, 104, multiple days in a row. And then as soon as the temperature broke, right back to nesting again. And that's important when you're thinking about annual recruitment. Embryo survival, obviously, if you're an egg, you have a temperature that you need to be incubated for proper development. And if you go outside of that range, what happens? Embryo dies. That's why birds have to incubate more or less at a constant temperature. And then ultimately, if you get through that stage, the chick survival. Chicks at temperatures like we have in the summer, out in full sun exposure, they might only be able to survive for 15 minutes without an incubating adult to shield them, or some type of vegetation or airflow or something else to dissipate heat. That's a short window. You better not be in the wrong spot during those 15 minutes. And then potentially even adult survival, although we don't have as much data on that subject yet. But y'all know this, habitat selection is rarely random. And if we think it's random, it's probably because we just don't know how to measure habitat selection very well. Maybe we're not measuring the right things. But animals are making decisions. They're driven by natural selection pressures to make decisions to pass on their genes. So they're at all times of the day, at all seasons, they're making not random, but very concrete decisions. Whether they're cognizant of the mechanism or not, we don't always know. But there's probably cues: vegetation height, vegetation structure, conspecifics, lack of conspecifics, predator community, etc., that's driving those decisions. But the consequences can be really dramatic, like where this group of scale quail chose to roost on this snowy night with temperature never broke zero can matter a lot to their survival over that season, or even their survival over that night. In my mind, this is probably the most important figure I'm going to show you. I've created this for almost every thermal project we've done, and they look remarkably the same. Regardless of the plant community or the taxa that we were studying, this is just the spread of available temperature across a landscape. Big scatter plot. And it's basically, we're looking at ambient temperature. Everybody know what ambient is? Like if you look on your weather app right now, that's what you're seeing is ambient. It's the temperature in a shaded box that's basically shielded from wind. It's shielded from convection. It's shielded from conduction. It's shielded from solar radiation. That's ambient. But what really matters is operative. That's kind of the feel-like temperature. You know what I'm saying? Like if we were outside having a field day, or if y'all are all gravitating to the shade, okay? So solar radiation is a big part of that, but you're also maybe wanting to get next to that sprinkler and catch a little mist, evaporative cooling. Maybe you're also wanting to get on a windy spot, convective cooling, get away from that sidewalk, induction. All those things are interaction. So it's not just solar radiation. The sun is the ultimate driver, but there's lots of different ways that we get heat or dissipate heat. And what that means is at a given ambient, you can have this huge range of operative. So at the same point in time on a landscape, when it might be, 33 degrees ambient, that operative feels like we've measured 40 degrees Celsius difference, the same point in time. And sometimes that 40 degrees is distance from me to here. Very short spatial distances. Think about that when you think about animal movement, how we measure it. Are we even measuring it at the right scale? We even have the technology to measure it at that kind of scale. The thing you start seeing real quick when you put temperature probes, and I'm not even talking about the animal yet, I'm just talking about the variation that's the background variation on the landscape. You see that it's very highly variable and somewhat predictable based on vegetation composition and structure. This is the same property. In fact, these pictures were taken almost immediately adjacent to each other. But I can tell you when it's 100 and most of the figures have Celsius, but I'm going to talk to you in Fahrenheit because that's most of us, that's the way we grew up thinking, or at least I did. So it's a little bit easier maybe to realize that. So forgive me for using Fahrenheit sometimes here, but if it was 105 degrees Fahrenheit, we often would measure operative temperatures in this Artemisia filifolia of 140. 140. Protein is denatured at 140. Most organisms cannot live very long at that temperature, just for a few minutes. Subsequently, scaled krill avoid Artemisia filifolia like it's the plague during the summer. During the winter, they use it. That's interesting. I always wondered that. Why? Till we put temperature probes in it. They can't survive there. Aromatic sumac, Rus aromatica, 105 Fahrenheit, 85 to 90 operative. Cooler than ambient. Why? I don't know. It's not shade because both of those are 100% canopy shaded out. It's not that. It could be absorption, color of the leaf. It's taking in heat versus reflecting radiant heat. That's possible. That's probably likely, actually. It could be some convection, like the architecture of the shrub breaks up airflow or doesn't break up airflow. Maybe that's part of it. Probably multiple mechanisms, but the variation is there. And spoiler, well, know it. And you can predict where they're going to be almost by looking at temperature alone. And another spoiler, this is not just something happening in Oklahoma where it's hot all the time. Quail and prairie chickens are thermally stressed at 85 degrees Fahrenheit. How much of the year is it 85 or above in Georgia? A lot. A lot. This has mostly been studied out west, but I guarantee it's happening across the world. Anywhere that, and it goes the other way too, cold. I'm mostly going to talk about heat, but there's some data in here on cold as well. So if you're a Galliform, y'all know what Galliforms are? It means chicken-like bird is what we're talking about. I love that. Grouse, quail, peacock, pheasant, partridges, those are Galliforms. A lot of the birds that we like to eat. A lot of them are domesticated around the world. How does a Galliform respond to this heat or cold? Well, the first thing they can do is gular flutter. You know, they don't sweat, right? They're not mammals. So they can rapidly, have you seen birds do this on a hot day? They move their throat, their tongue rapidly. What they're doing, basically, they have a lot of capillaries in their throat, and blood comes close to the surface. They move air rapidly across it back and forth, and it's heat dissipation. It's convective cooling, is what it is. It's also very energetically expensive. You burn a lot of calories doing that. And people, rightly say when it's cold, birds have to eat more consume more calories. True. They also have to consume a lot when it's hot. And that's a problem when you're at the verge of overheating and you've got to eat more calories to keep from dying from too much heat. So, but that is a strategy that helps them. But at some point, they got to maybe change where they're at, their space use, move to a different spot, find something cooler. But predators do that too. So that potentially puts you at predation risk. Maybe it's not a good place to be, all things being equal. You can move less, but you need more food. So that's a rub. How do you do that? Well, you probably need to be in a really food-rich environment or have food readily accessible next to thermal cover. Increase food intake. I already said that. You can forego reproduction. That's very energetically expensive, so you just don't breed. Remember a while ago when I said quail, we found would stop breeding when you had multiple days over 100? There's a reason. They can't afford it. They're trying to not overheat and die. And ultimately, some of them just die. They make bad decisions. They overheat. They put themselves in predator-rich landscapes. You name it. There's a lot of ways this can play out, but you start finding a lot of transmitters during these really cold and really hot periods. Nesting behavior in particular, they can, as I said, forego nesting, but there's also a lot of evidence that they can change their nest site selection. I'm going to show you some data on that in a second. They can also change their on off bouts when they get on and off the nest because, they do incubate for multiple days and they have to stay on that nest to keep it at the same temperature, but they also have to get off the nest and defecate and feed. They can't be there for 20-something straight days without doing those things, but they can change when they're on and off the nest. And yeah, even a tiny little quail that has a little bitty brain, apparently they have enough sense to figure this out because we've documented that based on temperature, somewhat predictive at what time they come on and off the nest based on the temperature of the day. It varies from day to day, cloudy day versus sunny day, 85 versus 105. And then sometimes they just abandon their nest. It's rare, but we have documented that in some cases. We think it is often related to heat. This is a simple graph, like everybody knows that this happens. This is basically showing you the temperature of the nest versus the temperature of the environment around the nest. And basically what you see is the nest, which is dark, it's always staying about the same temperature, 34 to 36 C. That's the range that those incubating eggs need to stay at for proper development. So even when it's hot, the nest is cool because the body of the bird, the adult, the hen or the male's incubating bobwhite nests often. That body of that animal is regulating the temperature. Then also when it's cold, they're keeping it higher. So they're keeping it cooler when it's hot, warmer when it's cold. See this with grouse, we see this with turkey, birds all over the world do this. As much as possible, keep it at a constant temperature so the embryo does not die. But here's something really interesting. What we've seen, and I can show you similar graphs for prairie chickens, turkey, and scaled quail, and bobwhite, all these species where we've put temperature probes in the nest and then right off the nest to see what the environment around looks like. They're choosing sites that are thermally buffered. They're choosing sites that tend to be warmer when it's cooler and cooler when it's warmer. I find that just remarkable. And these differences are really small spatial scales. Now, I don't know that the bird is cognizant of this. Maybe it's some cue about vegetation structure that's just correlated with the temperature. But this thermal buffering pattern we've seen repeatedly across taxa. And it's happening at really fine spatial scales. Here's a scaled quail project where we put a temperature probe in the nest bowl and then at 1 meter intervals, 5 meters away from the nest in different cardinal directions. And we see that these micro sites are not only thermally buffered compared to what's available broadly across a property or a landscape, they're thermally buffered in very short distances. Very subtle vegetation characteristics or topoedaphic characteristics that are making several degrees Celsius difference, which if you're a bird that's tied to that location that you more or less have to sit there for 20-something days, 2 or 3 degrees can be a big difference. That might be life or death of the embryos, perhaps life or death for the adult. I don't have a lot of time to go into this, so you're just going to take my word for it, but we've also seen a lot of evidence that they're modifying their own off-bouts when they choose to come on and off the nest. This was a study for both bobwhite and scaled quail, and we saw that a lot of the off-bouts were when the temperature, the ambient temperature was still colder than it needed to be to keep the eggs at the proper temperature, but it was on the upswing. At the point of inflection, when the temperature was about to come up to the right temperature, they would choose to come off. But before it got so hot that the embryo temperature would come up and die, they were back on, and they would do the reverse in the evening. And where we saw that temperature was really driving, it wasn't just angle of the sun, is that if you looked at that versus a cloudy day versus a sunny day, those times were shifting. And they really didn't match time of day very closely, but they did match temperature very closely. Brooding adults do that too. Once they hatch, if they hatch, most of them don't make it, but the ones that do hatch, we saw a lot of habitat selection that was similarly varied from day to day, depending on if it was a hot day, a cooler day, a sunny day, or a cloudy day. And a lot of foraging early in the morning when temperatures weren't too hot. As temperatures increased, you see where the broods were, which is the light color, versus the average landscape temperatures, they started to separate a lot. So in the morning, they were pretty similar. The whole landscape was uniformly coolish, but as the temperatures came up, there were places on the landscape that heated up quicker for various reasons, and those spots tended to be avoided. And the birds would often go into areas that we generally didn't even think of as good brood cover. In fact, I've been guilty of telling people, you should get rid of that. Like, that's not usable for broods. And then we start measuring broods at really fine scales, like, I gotta eat my words. It's not used most of the time, but when it's really hot, that's where they're at. So maybe it's not a not a bad idea to have a little bit of heterogeneity on the landscape. Adults without broods are making a lot of decisions too. This is see Carol et al. That was a Bob White study. So this shows you animal movement between 2-hour intervals across the day. And this is fun. If you've never, any of y'all do telemetry projects, your species of interest, you should try tracking an animal all day, like stay with it all day long. It's fascinating what you'll learn if you do that instead of just getting your once a day or once every 3-day location. Stay with the same animal all day long. That's what they did in this project. And we saw that across this day, you got a big trough in the heat of the day where movement dropped off dramatically. But on hot days, that trough is a lot deeper. Movement really drops off in the heat during the middle of the day. And it's almost like they're trying to make up for it on the ends. Moving more early and late, moving less middle. Whereas on cooler days, and it's really pronounced when we looked at turkeys. This is turkey data with days separated into 3 temperature classes: below 30, above 30, above 35. What's it? Or less than 35. So 3 different temperature classes. And you'll see that on the really cool days, the ones that were below 30°C, they're moving theoretically, probably foraging or feeding most of the day, all day long. There's a little bit of a trough, but it's shallow. When you get to the hottest days, those that are over 35°C, there's very little movement. In fact, most of that movement is probably just telemetry error. They're actually probably just sitting still, but there's always a little bit of error in the telemetry locations. All right. Hopefully, I've given you enough snapshots of different stages of a Galliform's life to convince you that, okay, somehow they're responding to temperature. It matters. It shapes how they view the world. Can you do anything about it? You can't go out there and turn the temperature down, right? It is what it is. But can you do anything about it? This picture says you can. That's the same soil type on the same landscape, clearly. The difference in this very herbaceous versus this very low statured shrub versus this tall statured shrub is management driven. That's all that explains that, is the manager and what they're doing on that property. And when you look at temperature based on vegetation type, just within vegetation type, broad coarse vegetation types, there can be a lot of differences. There's several different shrub species, and I was also guilty of I used to tell people, well, quail are shrub obligates. Prairie chickens, at least lesser prairie chickens use shrub. Greater prairie chickens, not so much, but a lot of these Galliformes do use shrubs. We would call them shrub obligates, so they just need shrub cover. Turns out they show selection between shrubs under certain environmental conditions, not all year round. But remember the picture earlier from the Artemisia filifolia versus the Russ, the sumac? At certain times of the year, we see dramatic selection or avoidance for certain shrub types. And often those are under environmentally stressful periods, either really hot or really cold. And it's pretty apparent why that might be when you see a graph like this. But even within the same vegetation type, now we're on greater prairie chickens. So this is tall grass prairie, pretty much devoid of woody cover. This is just tall grasses. The only difference here is time since fire management, prescribed fire. Very dramatic differences between the temperature of a recent burn, less than 6 months, versus a 2-year burn versus a 4-year burn. So yeah, that taller vegetation does provide screening cover from predators. Hear me, that's real. They're cognizant of raptors. They avoid raptors, but it looks like they also avoid really hot conditions. What this ultimately means is some landscapes become deserts under certain periods of time. And I mean desert here metaphorically, right? I mean, it's a place for that animal that is death trap, has no resources, it's barren to that animal. This is wild turkey data. And the dots are telemetry locations. Do you see the clustering around the green cool of that band of trees? Now, before you say, well, wait a minute, turkeys roost in trees, that's biased towards the roost locations. You're right, at night they do use trees, but in the daytime, on a cloudy day, they forage far from trees. These are Rio Grande wild turkeys. They'll go far out into herbaceous areas. On hot days, maybe go 15 or 20 meters and then they're right back in it, and then they're back out, and then they're back in it. Food resources are mostly in the herbaceous area. That's where they're chasing bugs, but they're staying cool and keeping from overheating by going back to the trees. All day long, you see this back and forth, back and forth. As soon as there's cloud cover, off they go across the prairie. It's very interesting. So a lot of the space that we think of as animal habitat may not be at some times of the year. What does that look like on a big area when you look at it across the year? This is Beaver Wildlife Management Area. If I took you there and you knew anything about quail habitat, and we drove across this 27,000 acre area, what you would probably say is this is wonderful. Every square inch of this is habitat for bobwhite. And across a 365-day year, you're right. But on a given day, under given conditions, that's wrong. And you see this by these 4 panels. B and C are kind of moderate temperature classes. A and D are extremes. A is hot, extreme, D is cold. During moderate times of the year, 80-something% of this landscape was predicted to be suitable, usable for bobwhite based on a maximum entropy model. Under the cold conditions, which really how we define cold was about 4 days a year. That was it. It met that category. Less than 17% of the landscape was used. All of a sudden, that huge WMA gets really small. And it's fascinating when you go to these spots, because I've done it, and you go and look and say, well, what's different? It's a very unique plant community. In this case, it's Chickasaw plum, or as they call it in Oklahoma, sand plum, Warnell Seminar, which turns out is apparently really good winter screening cover. That's where they gravitate to. And don't you know all the predators also know that? Whether it's a human hunter or a raptor, you go out there on the cold days and the Cooper's hawks are just circling the sand plum thickets, just waiting for a bobwhite to step out of it. They know where they're at and they concentrate their activity. So you might need to be there to not freeze, but while you're there, you've got all eyes on you. Changes survival. In fact, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. We'll skip to this slide. In fact, this is the same study where we saw that happen, an ecological pinch point, that when those birds constrained themselves to that 17% of the landscape, they took a big survival hit. A lot of predation. They weren't necessarily freezing to death or starving to death. Predation went up. They were concentrated, their space use was concentrated, and they really got hit hard by raptors. The raptors were there the whole season, but they were disproportionately hitting them during those periods where they were predictably found on a small portion of the world. And that can have big consequences. We had single storm events, 48 hours, where 15 to 20% of the whole radio telemetry population perished. That happens in February, right before the breeding season. That's a big hole to climb out of, even for our selected bird like bobwhite that can breed a lot. So the point of that is sometimes really small events, small cold periods, small heat periods can have big hits on survival, especially if it happens at the wrong time of year. We would see these cold weather events happening all winter, but we really generally didn't see a survival hit until they happened in February. Why? It wasn't necessarily colder in February than it had been in December. What's different in February? Body conditioning. Birds have burned through a lot of fat reserves. These are unfed, unsupplemented populations. Food resources are limited. So all of a sudden, that same blizzard that might have happened 6 weeks ago and been, that's a big deal. Because they were running out of calories and they couldn't stay in those cover thickets long enough. They exposed themselves, and the Cooper's hogs on them immediately. So I hope you're getting that even uncommon vegetation types sometimes can be really important. And we can miss that in telemetry work. If you're studying an animal and you're kind of averaging, there's a reason we say means are meaningless. When you average across a season or average across a year, these things don't pop out as very important because the animals may only be there a few days a year, a few hours a day, but it can have big consequences to their survival. So what about from a climate standpoint? I've almost exclusively talked to you and shown you data in the here and now, the present. the weather variability that we see now. And even without thinking about where climate's headed, you can see that animals are under a lot of stressors, environmental stressors, every day. But in a changing climate, it might look different. Depending on the organism or the place, it might be more or less stress. It can vary. It's not always negative, but it can be. So we decided to look into that a little bit, like what the future might look like for a group of Galliformes. So we did quail, 6 species of quail that occur in the United States. That's Montezuma, or also called Mearns quail, California quail, scaled quail, Gambel's quail, bobwhite. And I'm not going to talk about all these. We don't have time today, but I want you to highlight on the one you're probably most familiar with, bobwhite. It's the only quail that occurs naturally in this part of the world, the eastern United States. So the 3 colors I want you to pay attention to. This is a max int model looking at different climate scenarios out to the year 2080. Thanks for, we went to 2080. So the blue means it's currently in the historic distribution of bobwhite, and we assume that it's in the climate envelope, the space of climate that species can exist in. Okay, that's an assumption. It's probably more or less in the ballpark. The green means that the climate models mostly project that climate envelope might in the future extend into that area. So that might be unoccupied, but potentially from a climate standpoint, occupiable. That doesn't, but there's got to be other elements of habitat, right? If it's an urban area, well, that's not habitat. So it's not just thermal that matters. It's all the other things that constitute habitat. So that's another assumption here. We're assuming that the other aspects would be there. The red, this is the one to really pay attention to. The red are places that are currently in the climate envelope, the distribution of that animal. But the models suggest that climate might move away from there. So unless the animal can change its behavior or it's got a broader range of environmental conditions it can exist in, then we realize that might mean that species is going to really struggle. Not necessarily blink out immediately, but it might be harder for them to exist in that world in the future. Look at where the red is. The peninsula of Florida, South Texas, Western Oklahoma, Western Kansas. James, what are all those places to a bobwhite?
Very important.
Very important. Those are the strongholds. I mean, it's almost laughably ironic that the places that we hang our hat on for this species are the places that the climate model suggests are the ones that are most at risk. It's a little troubling. Now, that doesn't mean you should give up on places like Escape. It does not mean that. It does not mean that you should give up on South Florida. It does mean that in the future world, it might be harder to have stable populations that it might be under more environmental stress. But I say what it means more importantly is places like here that don't have a lot of bobwhite, places like Tennessee, where I grew up, that don't have a lot of bobwhite, they matter too. It's not enough to say, well, we've got quail in South Texas, or we've got prairie chickens in the Flint Hills. You need to think about this from a conservation standpoint, the 3 R's. I had conservation biology. You know these: resiliency, redundancy, and representation. This matters. Having redundancy, populations in different places, resiliency, diverse plant communities that provide mitigation for heat, environmental stresses, and representation, genetic diversity, depth to the genetic pool of the species. These things actually matter. And when you see a figure like this, to me, it really hits home. This is why it matters. Take-home points. Temperature varies a lot out there, and you'll know this. You do it every day when you step into the shade or you get off the sidewalk. You're making these decisions yourself, whether you think about it or not. Birds do too. They're not dumb. They're making these decisions at very fine spatial and temporal scales. They're highly responsive to this temperature. So some of the things that we see habitat selection wise are not always because they're trying to avoid predators. That's there too. But it's also because they're trying to avoid getting too hot, too cold, hypothermia. And this thermal cover, it should be part of your lexicon of what habitat looks like to an animal. And it's kind of invisible, like you can't see it. You can measure it, but you can't see it per se, but it's there, it's real. They feel it, we feel it. And if you're a manager, and I mostly work with managers, you're influencing this. If you burn, spray, disc, plow, cut a tree, do anything to alter vegetation, you're influencing. It's not just vegetation, it's also topographic, slope, aspect, elevation, those inherent things. But we really influence it through our vegetation management, mostly unaware. Having some variability in vegetation structure and composition is a good hedge against uncertainty. And especially in the absence of understanding these animals' thermal ecology and the variation in these landscapes, if nothing else, having some variability is a good hedge. It's a diverse portfolio against environmental extremes. But there's a lot more we can know about this subject. I picked some species that we know a lot about: bobwhite scale quail, wild turkey, prairie chicken. Those have been studied exhaustively, and we still don't really understand thermal ecology for those species very well, let alone a Bachman sparrow or five-striped sparrow or some of these species that there's just a handful of studies for. There's certainly no knowledge or information really about them, how they might be interacting with the thermal part of their habitat. I'd be real remiss if I didn't acknowledge all the people that made these data slides possible. I can't fit them all here, but here's a few of them. Great folks that are now spread across the country, doing great work, but really been a privilege to work with all these people over the past decade. And I also like to thank some of the sponsors, particularly my current employer, Tall Timbers, but also all these funding sources, various state and federal agencies that funded this work, and a lot of private folks, many of which don't want the glory, but they're happy to help support the work, but they want to remain anonymous. I'm grateful for them caring about wildlife and the places of wildlife called home. You want to know a little bit about how would you set up a study to even measure this kind of stuff? I did a paper in Wildlife Study Bulletin a few years ago. It's kind of written really for graduate students. It's kind of a crash course on how you could capture this kind of data, things to think about, maybe to use it, incorporate it into your study. And then, of course, just for James, a fine piece of German engineering right here in the presentation, doing what they do best.